I'm Caleb Monroe, 32, the middle child and estranged son. Dad's wake was held at St. Francis Chapel, the one with the dark wood rafters and the organ that always sounded slightly out of tune. I stood near the double doors in a pressed navy suit that didn't quite fit me right, slim cut in a room full of boxy shoulders and gold cufflinks. It was late afternoon, and the summer heat had found its way inside, curling the edges of the program stacked at the entrance table. His picture sat framed beside a bowl of Lily's dad, age 64, smiling in a boat he never invited me onto. I kept my hands in my pockets, mostly to keep from wringing them. My sister Amanda was already up near the altar, standing next to the podium, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she whispered something to Father Jensen. Her husband stood close behind, one hand on her back, the other clutching their baby daughter who was far too young to understand what death meant, but old enough to be dressed in pastel tulle for the occasion. A distant cousin spotted me by the door. He gave me a nod, but didn't come over. I waited. Someone from the church staff, a woman maybe in her 50s with short silver curls and a name tag that said Cheryl, approached me with that quiet, funeral home smile. "Can I help you find your seat?" I swallowed. "Actually, I just wanted to ask who's on the speaker list." She blinked. "Oh, that's already been arranged with the family. Only a few immediate members are doing eulogies. I'm his son." Her smile flickered. "Oh," she said again, then softer. "I'm sorry. I believe your brother Nathan and your sister Amanda are the only ones listed." I nodded, even though it felt like my lungs were too full of air. I watched as my Aunt Lucille passed by with a glass of sparkling cider, chatting with Amanda's friends from her law firm. My mother didn't even look my way. She was too busy adjusting the photo display behind the guestbook table. All pictures from Dad's softball days. None from our camping trip in '03. None of me holding his hand in the hospital the week before he died. The envelope in my inside jacket pocket felt heavier than it should. One page. His handwriting. A final letter he'd scribbled 3 days before slipping into that long silence morphine grants the dying. "Do you want me to seat you near the family section?" Cheryl offered gently. "I think I'll stay in the back," I murmured. Amanda stepped up to the microphone. Her voice was clear, confident. "Our father was a man of principle," she began, her words echoing off the wooden beams above. "He taught us that success was earned, not given." I stood behind a pillar. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. The letter felt like it was burning a hole through my chest. My name wasn't mentioned once. If you've ever been through something like this, drop a comment or let me know where you're watching from. Hit like or subscribe if family drama ever made you feel invisible too. Amanda was still speaking when I stepped forward. Quietly, calmly. The organist gave me a puzzled glance. A couple of heads turned as I made my way up the center aisle, the carpet absorbing the sound of my footsteps. I didn't speak until I reached the altar. "I have something to read," I said. Father Jensen tilted his head. "I'm sorry." "Who?" "My name's Caleb Monroe," I said evenly. "I'm Robert Monroe's son, his middle child." Silence. Amanda's mouth hung open. My brother Nathan half rose from his seat, his brows furrowed. Mom froze mid-reach for a candle lighter. I wasn't asked to speak. I continued, unfolding the paper slowly, deliberately. "But this is a letter he wrote to me before he died. And I think he wanted it heard." There was a long, cracking moment where time felt like it stalled, where people exchanged glances and confusion and something else. A shift. From the far-right pew, Judge Halbert, Dad's oldest friend and a man who'd written glowing tributes for the funeral program, stood up slowly. "Let the boys speak," he said, his voice steady and full of the kind of command that made people listen. And just like that, the crowd went still. Everyone looked at me, and for the first time in years, I felt them see me. The letter wasn't long, but I held it like it was sacred scripture. My hands didn't shake, but my voice cracked as I began. The chapel air had shifted dense now, as if every breath held back was waiting for mine. Caleb. I read aloud, the single name anchoring me. If you're reading this, I probably didn't get the timing right. That's been a pattern with us, hasn't it? There were a few soft, confused laughs from the front rows. Amanda looked frozen. Mom stared at the altar as if it betrayed her. I want to start by saying I'm sorry. Not in a general way, in the real way. The kind men say when they know they messed up. And no trophy or checkbook will fix it. You didn't get my time, Caleb. And you should have. My throat tightened. The last time I'd heard his voice had been from a hospital bed, low and fragile. But these words, these were still him, full, direct, without the layers he wore for everyone else. You were always different, quiet, but not small, smart, but not showy. And I didn't understand that. I spent so much energy trying to make you Nathan or Amanda. I thought success came in one flavor, and I tried to make you like it. I didn't see the man you were becoming, just the boy who wasn't like me. I could feel the room breathing with me. Even the crying baby had gone still. You showed up when I was sick, when I couldn't fake being invincible anymore. You sat next to me and told me about your screenplays. You didn't ask for praise, just presence. And I didn't give that enough. But I want you to know those stories, those characters. They stayed with me. I remember them clearer than any stock tip or coaching win. You made people up who felt more real than the versions I let live under our roof. I paused. I could hear someone sniffing in the back. Might have been Cheryl. Might have been me. I hope you keep writing. I hope you keep finding the words I never knew how to say. And I hope you know I loved you. Even if I wore that love like a tight shirt I never figured out how to unbutton. I folded the letter. The paper had soaked up sweat from my palms. I slipped it back into the envelope and turned to the crowd. That's all, I said softly. No applause. No reaction. Just silence, like the whole chapel had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. I didn't wait for permission. I stepped down and walked back to the last pew, heart pounding through layers of grief and shame and something unfamiliar. Maybe relief. I sat. I breathed. I stared at the floor until I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Judge Halberd. He really did admire you, the old man whispered. He just didn't know how to say it out loud. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to respond with words. After the service, the line for condolences stretched along the outer corridor. I didn't join it. I stood by the coat rack, waiting to see if anyone would come up to me on their own. The first was my cousin Lydia. I didn't even know he wrote you, she said, hugging me tightly. That was real. Thank you for reading it. Then a man I didn't recognize, gray suit, silver beard, introduced himself as Dad's old college roommate. Bob always bragged about your writing, he said. Said you were the only one who didn't try to sell his life back to him in words. Amanda passed behind us on her way to the reception. She glanced my way, lips pursed, but said nothing. Nathan avoided my eyes completely. I stayed behind a few minutes longer, watching people filter out under the evening sky. I wasn't invited to the private dinner afterward. I wasn't surprised. Instead, I walked down the chapel steps alone, past the rose bushes Dad used to trim on Saturdays when I was a kid. He used to make me rake the clippings while Amanda practiced flute and Nathan prepped for varsity debates. There had always been a hierarchy, whether spoken or implied. Nathan, the legacy. Amanda, the achiever. Caleb, the quiet one. The artist. The unreliable. I reached my car. I sat in the driver's seat for a while, not starting the engine. The letter was still tucked in my jacket pocket. I took it out again, not to read, just to hold. Something about the weight of it made me feel real. You see, Dad didn't hug much. He didn't tell us we were enough. He measured love in performance and presence at his events. But this letter, it was the closest thing to a you, mattered I'd ever gotten from him. A part of me wanted to call Amanda, to ask why I wasn't invited to speak. But another part of me already knew. She didn't think I'd come. And if I did, she didn't think I'd have anything worth saying. That had always been her story of me. The brother who drifted, who dropped out of business school, who freelanced, who sent Christmas cards late or not at all, who showed up with unshaven cheeks and secondhand shoes, who kept their distance. But that wasn't the full truth. The truth was, I had tried. I had driven Dad to his appointments when Nathan was in meetings. I had brought him soup when Amanda was on call. I had sat with him when he fell asleep watching baseball reruns. And I had listened, really listened, when he talked about regrets he didn't share with anyone else. That's what the letter was. A quiet confession to the child who had already forgiven him, long before he asked. I started the car and pulled into traffic. I didn't go home. I went to the cafe where I used to write between jobs, the one with the creaky floorboards and the barista who always played jazz even though no one ever tipped. I found a corner table, ordered a black coffee, took out my notebook. And I wrote. Not for a deadline, not for a submission, just for him, and for me. And maybe someday for the people who never got a letter at all. I didn't hear from Amanda or Nathan the next day. No text, no call, not even a passive-aggressive email about how I'd made it about myself. Honestly, I expected something. Instead, there was nothing. A complete, echoing silence. It was the kind of silence I'd grown used to in our family, polished, clean, undisturbed. The kind that looked respectful on the surface but buried anything real underneath. I spent the morning sitting on the couch in my apartment, the letter from Dad still tucked in the envelope, now creased at the corners from being opened and closed so many times. The words haunted me not in a painful way, but in a way that made me wonder what would have happened if he'd said them 5 years earlier, or 10, or if he'd ever just looked me in the eye and said, "You were never a mistake." Instead, I'd grown up thinking I was always just a little wrong for the room. When I was 12, I got a poetry award at school. Dad never came to the ceremony. He said work ran late. Amanda said, "That stuff doesn't matter anyway." Nathan asked if there was a cash prize. I sat alone in the cafeteria holding the little certificate with gold foil edges. The principal had read my poem out loud. I still remember the title, "The Boy with the Quiet Voice." That's who I'd been my whole life. Until that wake. At around 11 a.m., I got a knock at the door. It wasn't a sibling. It was my mother. I hadn't seen her in nearly a year. She stood in the hallway with her purse hanging off one arm and a thin folder clutched in her other hand like a life raft. "Can I come in?" she asked. I nodded and stepped aside. She looked around like she didn't expect the place to be clean, which, to be fair, it usually wasn't. But today, it was. She sat on the armchair near the window. I stayed on the couch. "I wanted to say thank you," she said after a long pause. "For what you read." I blinked. "You heard it, I did." Her voice was soft. She stared down at her hands. "You were the one he talked to most, those last few weeks." She continued. I should have noticed that. You were managing a lot." I replied carefully. She shook her head. "That's not an excuse. I didn't give you space to grieve. I didn't even ask if you wanted to speak. I didn't know what to say. I'd imagined this kind of conversation for years. In my head, it had fire, accusations, Tears. But now, with her sitting there so small, so tired, it just felt human. I brought something, she said, holding up the folder. I took it and opened it slowly. Inside were 2 photographs. One was of me as a baby, sitting on Dad's lap in the backyard, dandelions in the background. The second was a letter typed, dated 15 years ago. It was from Dad, addressed to the admissions office of a writing program I'd applied to and never knew he supported. It spoke about my curious imagination, my quiet persistence, and how his son, while unconventional, had the makings of a powerful storyteller. I stared at it for a long time. I found it when I was cleaning out his desk. Mom said, I thought, maybe it belonged to you. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper. I hadn't gotten into that program. I'd always assumed no one in my family believed in it anyway. But apparently, someone did. Thank you, I said. She nodded and stood up. I thought she might hug me, but she didn't. We were still learning how to stand in the same room without years of absence echoing between us. At the door, she turned back. Caleb, your father didn't always understand you, but I think he envied you. You weren't afraid to be different. He never knew how to do that. I watched her walk down the hall and disappear around the corner, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten child. I felt like someone whose presence had just landed. That night, I returned to the cafe and wrote again. The barista, Ella, gave me a knowing look. You're back on your rhythm, she said. I smiled. Something like that. I wrote until they closed, then walked home under a navy sky stitched with stars. The city was quieter than usual, or maybe I was just hearing it differently now. I passed a bookstore with a display of journals in the window. One of them had a leather cover almost identical to the notebook Dad used to carry when he was coaching. I bought it the next day, started writing in it the day after that. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't even meant for publication. It was just the truth, finally unfiltered. I wrote about the way he used to whistle while mowing the lawn, about the time he built a treehouse but forgot to put in a ladder, about the way he'd sneak extra fries to me when Mom wasn't looking, and the way he said nothing when I came out to him at 19, nothing except, "You're still my kid." That one sentence had kept me breathing for months afterward. Sometimes I think grief is less about the big moments and more about the 1,000 small ones that never happened. The conversations left unsaid. The pictures never taken. The invitations never offered. But then you get a letter. A real one. Written in shaking hands and regret. And maybe, just maybe, it opens a door you thought was locked forever. 2 weeks later, Amanda called. It rang twice. I almost didn't answer. "Hey," she said when I picked up. "Hey." Silence. I should have told you about the speaker list," she admitted. That wasn't fair. I waited. You were there for him in the end. I wasn't. I was trying to hold it together, and I just boxed you out. Like always. Yeah, I said quietly. You did. But what you read, it hit hard. Not just for me. For a lot of people. Even Nathan cried. I raised an eyebrow. Seriously, don't tell him I told you. We both chuckled. It felt strange, like speaking to a version of my sister I hadn't met before. One with less armor. I'm glad you read it, she added. It was overdue. Yeah, it was. We didn't solve everything that night. We didn't even talk for long. But when we hung up, I saved her contact under a new name, Amanda. Not the enemy. It was stupid, but it meant something. Families are messy. Ours maybe more than most. But now, there was a thread tying me back in, not through obligation or shared pain, but through one small, imperfect act of being seen. And sometimes, that's enough. The weeks that followed felt quiet in a way I hadn't expected. Not empty, just still. I wasn't rushing to forgive everyone, but I also wasn't drowning in resentment anymore. Something had shifted. I went on long walks. I opened old journals. I stopped deleting my drafts before finishing them. For the first time in years, I wasn't writing to prove anything. I was writing to breathe. One afternoon, about a month after the wake, I got a letter in the mail. A real one. Handwritten address. No return stamp. Inside was a single page folded neatly in thirds. It was from Nathan. I stared at the signature first. Nathan R. Monroe, as formal as ever. The letter began stiffly, like he was dictating it through a clenched jaw. But something softened halfway through. He mentioned Dad's old Chevy, how they used to fix it together in high school. Then, out of nowhere, he said I used to hate how quiet you were. I thought you were judging me. But now I think maybe you were just listening, and I never really gave you credit for that. That was it. No apology, no warmth, but an acknowledgement. And that, from Nathan, was a thunderclap. I wrote him back, short and plain, just a thank you and a line about how I used to watch him at debate tournaments from behind the auditorium curtain. I told him I always admired how sure he sounded, even when he was bluffing. He didn't respond, but 2 days later, I got a Venmo notification. Nathan Monroe paid you $200. Message for the coffee shop. Keep writing. I smiled so hard my face hurt. I used the money to rent a studio space downtown. Nothing fancy, just a dusty converted attic above an antique store. But it had light, tall windows, and creaky floors. A view of the river, and silence. The kind of silence you could fill with your own voice. I moved my writing desk there, set up a second-hand armchair in the corner, and filled the walls with old photos. One of me and Dad at a baseball game. One of the 3 of us siblings at the lake when we were kids, squinting into the sun. I even pinned up the letter he wrote me, the original, and beside it, the one he wrote to the writing program, now slightly yellowed. It became a kind of shrine, not to grief, to growth. I started calling Mom once a week. The conversations were careful at first, but slowly they got easier. We talked about grocery store finds, about the neighbor's loud dog, about the way Dad used to hum off-key in the shower. She sent me a photo of one of his journals she found, pages of lists, books he meant to read, things he regretted. One list simply read, stuff I never said, but should have. I was proud of Caleb. Amanda's strength scares me. Nathan isn't me, and that's okay. I should have apologized more. It's okay to be scared. I copied that list into my own notebook. Word for word. One evening, as I was locking up the studio, I got a call from Amanda. Again, I want to run something by you, she said, cutting straight to it. As usual. Okay. There's a literary grant, she continued. Dad had some money left in his foundation account. We were planning to donate it somewhere, but I thought, maybe we could use it to fund young writers, in his name, but maybe curated by you. I didn't know how to respond. I mean, if you don't want to, that's fine. It was just a thought. I stood in the stairwell, phone to my ear, the scent of old wood and dust surrounding me like a cocoon. I'd like that, I said finally. But only if it includes kids like me, the quiet ones, the ones nobody asks to speak. She paused. Exactly what I had in mind. We named it the Quiet Voice Fund, in memory of Robert Monroe, but curated by the son who never fit the mold. Word got out slowly. A few local schools reached out. A librarian in Oregon asked if we'd sponsor a poetry night. We said yes. Every time. We didn't turn it into a big operation. No glossy website or press releases. Just word of mouth. A mailbox. A monthly check. A few months later, I received a letter from a high school sophomore named Daniel. He wrote, "I didn't think anyone would care about the stuff I write. It's weird. Sad. My mom says I'm too sensitive. But then my teacher told me about your fund, and I read about how you spoke at your dad's funeral, and I thought, maybe I'm not broken." I read that line 3 times before I cried. Not the silent, stoic kind. The full, raw kind you feel in your ribs. Because that was the point, wasn't it? We spend so much time pretending we're fine. We learn to armor up, stay composed, say the right thing at the right time. But underneath it all, we just want someone to hear us. To say, "I see you." To say, "You matter." That's what Dad finally did. Too late. Maybe. But not too late for me to carry it forward. There's something strange about being seen when you've spent your life invisible. It doesn't feel like a spotlight. It feels like being led into a room that was always yours. You just didn't have the key. One morning, Amanda stopped by the studio. She brought coffee and her daughter, Grace, now almost 2. She toddled around the space with wide eyes and sticky fingers. Amanda looked at the letter on the wall and then back at me. "I think he wanted you to have this space," she said. "He didn't even know it existed. I think he knew you needed somewhere to be yours." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I walked over to the window and looked out at the river, slow and silver under the morning light. Then I turned back and smiled. "Yeah," I said. "I think you're right." Amanda stayed for an hour. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't try to fix anything. We just existed, 2 siblings finally meeting each other as equals, without the weight of roles or rivalry. Before she left, Grace pointed at the photo of Dad on the wall and said, "Who's that?" Amanda hesitated. Then she looked at me. I knelt beside Grace and said, "That was your grandpa. He was a complicated man, but he loved his family, even when he didn't know how to show it." Grace stared at the photo a moment longer, then nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe we all do eventually. The studio became more than a writing space. It became a second kind of home, the kind that didn't remind me of closed doors or seating charts. I started meeting with young writers there, mostly local students who'd heard about the Quiet Voice Fund through teachers or youth centers. Some came shy and skeptical, others with spiral notebooks overflowing. But all of them shared something unspoken. They weren't used to being heard. One girl, Mia, barely spoke the first 2 times she visited. She stared at her sneakers and mumbled her name. But on the 3rd visit, she handed me a short story she'd written about a girl whose thoughts were too loud for her mouth. It was beautiful, raw, the kind of writing you don't teach, you just recognize. "Can I read this out loud?" I asked. She nodded, still not meeting my eyes. I read it from the same chair where I'd first read Dad's letter. Her words filled the room, and when I looked up, she was crying, not loudly, just one of those quiet, unstoppable leaks from the corners of her eyes. "No one's ever said my writing was good," she whispered. I didn't say something big. I just said, "It is." And that seemed to be enough. I started hosting small circles once a month. 10 people max. We read aloud. We talked about rejection, about parents who didn't get it, about teachers who tried to change our voices. It wasn't therapy, but it felt healing. Sometimes I'd look at the wall where Dad's letter hung and think, "You gave me more than you knew." That page wasn't just his redemption, it was my foundation. One night, after a long editing session with a student named Ramon, I stayed behind to clean up. It was raining lightly, the kind of drizzle that painted everything in silver shadows. I stood at the window and remembered something I hadn't thought of in years, a night when I was 16, sitting in the garage with Dad while he polished his old golf clubs. He didn't say much, but he handed me one, a 7-iron, and said, "This one's yours if you want it." I'd never played golf. Still haven't. But I remember how heavy it felt in my hands, and how he didn't look at me when he offered it, like maybe the gesture was too much for eye contact. I never took the club home with me when I moved out. I left it hanging on the garage wall. The memory tugged at something. The next morning, I called Mom. "Do you still have Dad's old golf set?" She paused. "In the garage." "Why I want the 7-iron?" She laughed softly. "You planning to play now?" "No," I said. "I just need to hold it again." She didn't ask more. The next day, I found it on my front doorstep, leaning gently against the wall, wrapped in an old towel like it was sacred. I brought it to the studio, hung it on the wall beside the letters. It didn't match the space, and yet, somehow, it fit perfectly. That same week, a former professor of mine reached out. He'd heard about the fund, said he remembered my senior project, a fictionalized memoir about an overlooked sibling at a funeral. "You always had something," he said. "You just needed the right moment to speak." He asked if I'd consider teaching a workshop at the university, something small, non-credit, just for students who didn't quite fit the creative writing mold. The idea terrified me. Me, a teacher. But I said yes. Not because I felt qualified, but because someone had to stand in front of those students and tell them, your voice matters before it's polished, before it's loud, before it's published. The first session, I nearly backed out. My hands shook. I kept thinking about all the times I'd been talked over, laughed at, dismissed. But then I looked at the room half full, quiet, hesitant faces, and I realized they weren't looking for perfect. They were looking for permission. So I gave it. We started with silence, a full minute. Then I said, "Tell me about the moment someone didn't ask you to speak but you had something to say." One by one, they did. I didn't tell them my story that day. But a few weeks later, one of the students, Jade, stayed behind. "I Googled you," she said. I raised an eyebrow. She grinned. "I saw the wake video. Someone uploaded it. You reading the letter?" My stomach twisted. "That's out there." "It's beautiful," she said simply. I watched it 3 times. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to hide, but part of me, the part that had stood at that podium, heart raw and hands trembling, felt proud. I sent it to my dad. Jade added, "We haven't talked in a year." He watched it, and he called me. I blinked. "Just wanted you to know," she said. Then she left. I sat in the empty classroom for a long time after that, the ripple effect of a single letter. Dad probably never imagined his words would stretch this far. He wrote them, I think, just for me. But that's the thing about truth. Once it's spoken, it never stays small. It echoes. Amanda called again that weekend. We had started speaking more, but it was still surprising when she initiated. "Grace drew a picture of you," she said. "Said you were reading her a story." "She's never seen me read her a story," I said. "Yeah," Amanda replied. "I think she just assumed you do." She sent a photo. A stick figure with curly hair, mine, a book in hand, and a child in a pink dress sitting cross-legged. Over the drawing was a crayon title, Uncle Caleb Reads. I didn't know what to do with that, either. So I printed it and taped it on the studio wall, right beneath the 7-iron. That weekend, I attended my first family dinner in over 3 years. It wasn't planned. Amanda texted, said Nathan was bringing dessert and Mom was making pot roast, and you should come, no pressure. I stared at the message for an hour before replying. What time? When I walked in, no one made a speech. No one apologized. They just made space. Nathan handed me a drink and said, You want to sit next to Grace. She's been asking where you were. Amanda burned the carrots. Mom made too much gravy. Grace spilled juice on my shirt. It was the best night I'd had in a long time. Later, as we were clearing plates, Amanda touched my arm. You belonged here the whole time. You know. I nodded. Slow. I do now. The holidays came faster than I expected that year. For the first time since Dad died, the thought of Thanksgiving didn't fill me with dread or resentment. Amanda invited me again this time weeks in advance, with a note that just read, "You better bring your famous mashed potatoes." It was the same dish I'd made once in college, completely by accident, using garlic salt instead of regular salt and far too much butter. But everyone had loved it, mostly because I served it with self-deprecating humor and the kind of awkward charm that seemed to get me through most Monroe gatherings back then. I hadn't made it since, but that Thursday, I peeled and boiled and mashed and stirred, just like I used to, humming to myself. The kitchen filled with that warm, familiar scent, and for the first time in years, I felt connected to something beyond my own walls. Like maybe I didn't have to keep living as a satellite orbiting the Monroe family. Maybe I could land. When I arrived, Nathan was already there, standing in the front yard with Grace, tossing small red leaves into the air and pretending they were magic. His blazer was slightly wrinkled, which was unusual for him. He looked up and smirked. "You really brought the potatoes I lived to serve," I replied, holding up the Tupperware like a trophy. Amanda came to the door with a glass of wine. "Kitchen's yours," she said. "Just don't start a grease fire like you did in 2012. That was not entirely my fault." I said, "Right. The pan attacked you." We were bantering. Like normal people. Like siblings who'd survived something. Together. And didn't need to pick apart every second of it anymore. Inside. Mom was wearing the same cranberry-colored sweater she always wore this time of year. She hugged me with both arms. "It's good to see you. You too." We didn't have to say more. Not right then. The meal was messy and loud. Grace knocked over her apple juice again. Nathan made a pun that made Amanda groan. We argued over which movie to watch later, and whether pumpkin pie was overrated. No one mentioned Dad. Not directly. But his absence was a presence in itself. Like the chair that stayed empty at the head of the table. Until Mom placed a small photo frame next to the salt shaker. It was a picture of him and me in the garage, the same memory I'd recalled in the studio. The 7-iron in my hand. No one said anything about it. But we all looked at it at different moments. And in each glance, I felt a strange sort of peace settle over the table. After dessert, Amanda pulled me aside while the others played a card game Grace had made up. "There's something else," she said. I didn't want to mention it earlier, but we found another letter. In Dad's things. My heart stopped for a second. "It's not just for you," she added. "It's for all three of us." But he addressed it to you. He wanted you to read it aloud. Together. I took the envelope carefully. It was smaller than the last one, sealed but brittle at the corners. I didn't open it there. I just nodded. "I'll do it. Just not tonight. Whenever you're ready," she said. The next morning, I called Nathan and Amanda, asked them to meet me at the studio that Sunday. No big speeches, just the three of us, together. They arrived 10 minutes early. Amanda brought muffins, Nathan brought coffee. We sat on mismatched chairs under the letters and photos and that old golf club. "I haven't read it yet," I told them. "I wanted it to be with both of you." They nodded. I opened the envelope slowly, careful not to rip the paper. Dad's handwriting was more uneven than the first letter. These were the words of a man closer to the end, but somehow they felt more certain. "To my three," it began. Amanda put her hand over her mouth. Nathan sat up straighter. I never learned how to say the things that mattered. I read. I taught you how to compete, how to aim high. But I didn't teach you how to rest, or how to forgive, or how to sit in a room together and just be still. He went on. I was proud of all of you. But I showed it wrong. Amanda, you were fierce from the start. I leaned on that too much. I forgot you needed protection sometimes, not just praise. Nathan, you were always chasing my approval, and I made you think it had to be earned. I see that now. I'm sorry. Nathan turned his face away, blinking hard. And Caleb. I paused. You didn't demand anything, and I gave you even less. You were the mirror I didn't want to look into. Sensitive, creative, free in ways I never allowed myself to be. I hope you never stop being all of those things. I swallowed. Amanda reached for my hand. Nathan stared at the floor. I'm writing this not to explain everything. I continued, but to say the best parts of me lived in each of you. I see that now. It's not too late to know that. Not too late to believe it. The letter ended simply. I love you, Dad. I folded the paper slowly. No one spoke for a long time. Then Nathan broke the silence. Damn, he said. That really was him, wasn't it? Yeah, I said quietly. It was. Amanda wiped her eyes. Do we frame it? I think we keep it here, I said, gesturing to the studio. Let it live where stories get told. They both nodded. We didn't linger after that. Nathan had somewhere to be. Amanda needed to get Grace from a playdate. But before they left, they each hugged me. Not stiffly, not out of obligation. Real hugs. The kind you remember. I stayed behind, sat in the silence of the studio. I thought about that photo from years ago, me and Dad in the garage, about the things he never said, about how I had filled that silence with stories. And then, years later, how he'd finally answered back, not with perfection, but with truth. That was enough. A week later, Mia came back to the studio with a full short story collection. She handed it to me proudly. I dedicated it to you. I opened the first page. There it was. For Caleb Monroe, who showed me how to speak. Even when no one was listening. I didn't cry. I smiled. Then I said, You ready to read at the next open mic? She grinned. I think I am. We hung her flyer beside the letters. She picked the center spot. When the night came, she stood in front of strangers and read her words without flinching. The room was so quiet you could hear the radiator creak. After she finished, the applause didn't just sound, it echoed. Just like Dad's voice still did. Just like mine finally could. Spring arrived without fanfare. The kind of early spring where everything still looks like winter. But the air starts to soften around the edges. The light changes before the trees do. That's how I felt, too different on the inside before anything visibly changed. The studio had become a rhythm. I arrived every morning at 9, sometimes earlier. I made coffee in the little corner pot, flipped the lights on slowly, and opened the blinds just enough to let sunlight in without blinding the room. A stack of notebooks sat by the window, now mine, the students'. Some from strangers who came just once and left their words behind. I didn't read all of them, but I kept every one. In early April, I received an invitation I wasn't expecting. It came from the university's literary department. They were planning a memorial lecture series on storytelling and legacy and wanted me to deliver the keynote. We were moved by your work, the letter read, but more than that, by your honesty. I sat with the envelope in my lap for 20 minutes before calling Amanda. You're doing it, she said immediately. No backing out. I don't know. I said, I'm not academic. I barely graduated. That's exactly why they want you. Because you lived it. You didn't just study it. Nathan echoed the same thing in his own way. Talk like you did at the wake. He texted. Just say the truth. People need that. So I said yes. The lecture was scheduled for May 3rd, a Thursday. I had a month to prepare. I stared at a blank page every morning for the first 2 weeks. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding like I'd climbed some personal mountain. I wasn't healed. I wasn't some transformed hero. I was still figuring it out. Still missing him. Still waking up some mornings angry for the years he wasted. Still writing him into every character, every scene. But eventually, I started typing. One sentence, then another. I didn't write a lecture. I wrote a letter. To Dad. Again. Only this time. I wrote it in front of a room filled with people. Professors, students, strangers. Amanda sat in the second row. Nathan leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Mom wasn't there. She said she didn't think she could handle it, but she called that morning to say she was proud. I stepped up to the microphone with trembling fingers and a folded page in my hand, and I read, Dear Dad. I began, You weren't there the way I needed. And I carried that for a long time like a weight I didn't know how to set down. I looked out at the crowd. They were listening. Really listening. You missed my writing award, my graduation. You forgot to ask how I was when I moved out. And for years, I told myself that meant I didn't matter to you. A few heads nodded. A few faces softened. But now I know it wasn't that I didn't matter. It was that you didn't know how to show it. You were carrying your own silences, your own unmet needs. You just passed them down, the way people do without meaning to. A long breath. You wrote me a letter before you died, the first honest one I ever got. You said I reminded you of the parts of yourself you buried, that I was the mirror you avoided. I let the words hang. Well, Dad, I looked in that mirror. I kept looking, and I found something there. Not just pain, not just questions, but clarity. I glanced down at the paper. I'm not angry anymore. At least, not every day. Some days. I even feel grateful, because your silence taught me how to listen. Your absence taught me how to show up. And your final letter, it gave me permission to become someone I'd been all along. I folded the paper. The room was quiet in the best way. Not tense. Not awkward. Just full. Someone clapped. Then another. Then the room erupted. But I didn't soak in it. I stepped off the stage and walked straight outside, where the air was warm and thick with lilac. Amanda followed. She didn't say anything. Just handed me a bottle of water and leaned her head on my shoulder. You killed it, she said eventually. I smiled. We stood there in silence. The good kind. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked to the studio at midnight. The city was quieter than usual. When I arrived, I unlocked the door, turned on the soft amber lamp in the corner, and sat down at the desk. I pulled out my notebook, wrote 4 words at the top of a new page, the Quiet Voice memoir. It felt both terrifying and inevitable. I didn't know what it would become. A book, a journal, a letter stitched from all the fragments. But I knew I had to write it, not for closure, for connection. Because the thing about being invisible for so long is, when you finally speak, when you finally let yourself be heard, it isn't about volume, it's about resonance. The next morning, I told my workshop students about the lecture. One of them, Theo, asked if I would publish the letter. I think a lot of dads need to hear it, he said. Maybe, I replied. Maybe a lot of sons do too. They asked me to read it again. So I did. And afterward, no one said anything. One girl cried. Another boy clapped once, then stopped and said, Thank you. Seriously. They all stayed late that day. Afterward, I found a note someone had left behind on my desk. Thank you for making silence feel safe again. I taped it beside Mia's dedication. The wall was starting to look like a living story, a collage of every person who once felt like they didn't belong and found out they did. One voice at a time, one page at a time, one imperfect, unwavering truth at a time. That week, Amanda called again. Not about family, not about plans, about her daughter. Grace wants to write a story, she said. Can she come to the studio? Absolutely. I replied. She showed up with a glitter pen and a pink notepad. Sat on the floor, scribbled a story about a dragon who lost its fire but found its song. I didn't help. I didn't edit. I just asked if she wanted to read it out loud. She stood on my chair, paper shaking, voice trembling, and she read. It wasn't perfect. It didn't have a plot, but it was hers. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "Can we hang it on the wall too?" I nodded. We can. And we did. That night, when they left, I turned off the lights and stood in the dark a little longer than usual. The studio was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It never would be again. The summer after the lecture passed in slow, golden days. The studio, which had started as a refuge, was now a living organism full of voices, movement, breath. I spent my mornings writing alone, and my afternoons listening to others. The walls were no longer bare. They held a mosaic of lives. Letters, drawings, scraps of poems, notes that read, "This is the first time I said this out loud." And still, Dad's letter remained at the center, not framed in gold or spotlighted, but there, faded, folded, touched, like it belonged in every story told since. By July, word had spread beyond the city. I started getting emails from community centers, teachers, small libraries in other towns. They'd heard about the Quiet Voice Fund. They wanted workshops, mentorship, anything I could offer. I couldn't say yes to everything, but I answered every message, because I remembered being that kid, the one refreshing his inbox and hearing nothing. Being unseen is one kind of pain, but being ignored after reaching out, that's a wound you carry deep. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Sarah in Vermont. She ran a program for teens dealing with grief and trauma. She'd found the Wake video, watched the lecture. It wasn't just a eulogy. She wrote, it was a map. Would you come speak to our group? I hesitated. Vermont was far. I didn't love public speaking, and I wasn't sure I was the person they needed. But the sentence stuck with me. It was a map. A week later, I packed a small bag, printed out Dad's letter, and flew to Burlington. The center was small, tucked between a laundromat and a bakery. The room they gave me had mismatched chairs and string lights hanging from the ceiling. On one wall was a mural of open hands holding fireflies. There were 14 kids. Ages ranged from 12 to 19. They looked at me with guarded eyes. Not hostile, just tired. I introduced myself the same way I always did. I'm Caleb. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a genius. I just had a dad who didn't know how to say goodbye. That made a few heads tilt. I didn't give them advice. I read Dad's letter. I read mine. Then I asked one question. What's the thing you wish someone had said to you and never did at first? Silence. Then one boy, tall, lanky, maybe 17, murmured that they weren't leaving because of me. Another girl said that I didn't have to be the strong one. A third whispered that I was worth staying for. I didn't comment. I just nodded after each one. We spent 2 hours writing those sentences into something larger. Some kids wrote letters. Some wrote scenes. One just drew a single I with the word "C" beneath it. Before I left, Sarah pulled me aside. "You got them to speak?" she said. "Do you know how rare that is?" "I think they've been speaking," I said. "Just no one's been listening in the right direction." On the flight home, I stared out the window, thinking about Dad again, about how many versions of him had lived in my mind. The coach, the ghost, the silence, the man in the boat who smiled in the funeral photo, and the man who, in the end, used what little time he had to write me into the world. When I landed, Amanda called. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Her tone was serious. "Okay," I said. "It's about the will." I froze. "What about it?" "Dad made changes. About a year before he died. I didn't want to bring it up before because, well, honestly, I thought you'd think I was trying to make up for something." "Amanda, what did he do?" "He left you the house. I didn't speak. You don't have to take it." She rushed on. "You can sell it, rent it, do nothing." But he did that. Quietly. No fanfare. Just a line in the revision. "The house goes to Caleb. Because he stayed when no one else could." I sat down on the edge of the bed. "Why didn't you tell me I was scared?" she said. "That you'd think we were trying to buy your forgiveness." And now I just didn't want it to be a secret. Not after everything we've built back. I drove to the house the next day. I hadn't been there in almost 2 years. It looked smaller than I remembered. The yard was overgrown. The porch light was out. But the scent, the mix of pine and old books, still hit me the moment I stepped inside. His chair was gone. So was the desk. But the hallway wall still had my childhood drawings taped inside a dusty frame. The one with the monster and the boy who tamed it with a whisper. I walked room by room. Amanda had boxed up most of the belongings. A few trophies remained on the shelves. The walls were blank. I sat on the living room floor and listened to the silence. Then I opened my notebook, wrote, "He left me the house. But what he really gave me was the ability to return. I didn't know what I would do with it. Maybe nothing. Maybe turn it into a retreat for young writers. Maybe sell it and pour the funds into the grant. But for now, it would sit, unchanged. A monument not to perfection, but to the slow, painful repair of love." As I locked up, I found one last envelope in the mailbox. No stamp. Just a folded piece of paper. It read, "I saw what you did at the wake. I never had the guts to speak. But you did. Thank you for saying the thing I never could." There was no signature. Just silence again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was full. Of echoes. Of names. Of everything we carry but rarely name. I drove home with the windows down, letter in the passenger seat, wind curling through the pages of my notebook. At a red light, I looked over and saw a father teaching his son to tie a tie in the mirror of their parked car. The boy looked impatient. The father looked nervous. They caught my gaze. I nodded once. The man smiled. And maybe he went home that night and said the thing he was afraid to say. Maybe his son heard it. Maybe he didn't. But somewhere, another story began. In September, a year after Dad's funeral, Amanda called and asked if we could host a small event, something private. Just the 3 of us and Mom. No press, no speeches, just acknowledgement. "We never actually scattered his ashes," she said. "They've been in that metal urn on the bookshelf for months. I thought you and Nathan already." "No," she said. "We were waiting. I think maybe we were waiting for you. So we planned it for the last Sunday of the month. Nathan offered his cabin by the lake, same one Dad used to take us to when we were kids. I hadn't been there in years. I almost said no, but I didn't. That morning, I drove up with a folded copy of the original letter in my back pocket, and a thermos of coffee I knew no one would drink but me. The trees had just begun to turn the kind of early orange that looked like the world was slowly catching fire in the best way. The lake shimmered like a sheet of glass, untouched and waiting. Amanda arrived first, in a soft gray sweater, her daughter asleep in the car seat. Nathan came last, carrying the urn in both hands like it weighed more than it did. No one said much at first. We sat on the porch for a while, watching the breeze curl across the water. Grace woke up and asked where Grandpa's bottle was going. Amanda knelt beside her and whispered something I couldn't hear. Eventually, we walked to the dock. Nathan uncapped the urn. Amanda held Grace's hand. Mom stood a few feet back, wrapped in Dad's old flannel jacket, the sleeves too long for her arms. I stepped forward and pulled out the letter, not to read aloud, just to hold. I didn't need to say the words again. I needed to feel them. Nathan took a deep breath. He'd hate this, he muttered. Too sentimental. Amanda smiled. He'd pretend to hate it, but he'd be watching from the woods, tearing up behind his sunglasses. We all chuckled. Then Nathan tipped the urn and let the ashes fall. They caught the wind. Some of it drifted across the water. Some of it landed on our shoes. Some of it rose like smoke and vanished. It didn't feel like a goodbye. It felt like releasing a version of him that had already left long ago. Afterward, we sat in silence again. Not tense, just full. Then Mom reached into her coat and pulled something out, a small, worn envelope. He wrote this, she said. I found it after the first letter, but I wasn't ready to read it. Now I think maybe you all should. Amanda opened it carefully and read aloud. My family, it began. I don't know what the world will remember of me. I was a coach, a father, a man who struggled to say what he meant. But I hope when the noise fades, you remember this. I was learning. I didn't finish the lesson, but I started. We looked at each other, and then Amanda folded the letter, placed it in her coat, and said, Let's go inside, back at the cabin. Grace asked if we could tell stories, but only the funny ones, she said. Nothing sad. So we did. Nathan told the one about Dad locking himself out of the car at the gas station with a burrito in one hand and a raccoon sneaking into the trunk. Amanda told the one about him burning the turkey and trying to replace it with rotisserie chickens that still had price stickers on the wings. And I told mine about the treehouse with no ladder, and how Dad insisted it was character building. Grace laughed so hard she fell off the couch. It felt like resurrection. Not of the man himself, but of everything we forgot we loved about him when the wounds were fresh. Later, as I was leaving, Nathan caught me at the door. You gonna keep the house, he asked. I don't know, I said. Part of me wants to sell it. Part of me wants to turn it into a writer's place. For kids like Mia and Theo. Nathan nodded slowly. You should. Dad wouldn't have known how to do that. But he'd be proud you did. Then, quietly, I'm proud you did. I blinked. That was the first time Nathan had said anything like that in our entire lives. We hugged, briefly, but it meant everything. On the drive home, I took the long way past the high school where I used to pretend not to care, past the field where Dad once tried to teach me how to throw a spiral, past the diner where I'd eavesdrop on strangers just to steal their dialogue for short stories. I realized I remembered everything, not because it was all good, but because it all made me, that night. I returned to the studio. I turned on the lamp, sat at the desk, opened my notebook to the last page, and I wrote. There are many kinds of fathers. Mine was flawed, but he gave me one true gift. He reminded me that even silence has a voice, if you're willing to listen. I closed the notebook and placed it in the center of the desk. Then I looked at the wall. The letter was still there, faded now, edges curling. But it held. It always held. Behind me. The studio clock ticked softly. The kind of sound you don't notice until the world goes quiet enough to let it count. I sat back, breathed, and let it. I didn't expect the letter to change my life. I didn't expect Dad to become a part of my voice, or for his final words to open so many locked doors. But by the time fall deepened and the air began to bite in the mornings, I started to understand something I hadn't been able to say aloud until then. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at him, not at my family, not even at the years I'd lost. Grief is a strange companion. At first it screams, then it whispers, then it simply walks beside you. And one day, you look up and realize it's been replaced by something else, quiet understanding, or maybe just a gentler kind of ache. The studio continued to grow. We added more programs, weekend sessions for kids who couldn't come on school days, a scholarship for students who had lost a parent. Amanda helped with the paperwork. Nathan, surprisingly, started handling some of the fundraising. He had contacts. He said he wanted to make use of them. He never said it outright, but I think it was his way of carrying a corner of the legacy that wasn't just his anymore. One night, around mid-November, I came back to the studio late after giving a talk at the library. I was exhausted. My voice was hoarse, but I wasn't ready to go home. Not yet. The air inside smelled like old books and dried coffee. On the wall, beneath the photo of Dad and me in the garage, someone had left a new note without signing it. I didn't think anyone would care what I had to say. You proved me wrong. Thank you. I added a thumbtack, smoothed the corners, then I turned on the recording mic I used for workshops and said, "Test." And then, without planning it, I started recording. Not for a podcast, not for an audience, for the record, for my record. I was the son who didn't speak. I said softly. I was the one who didn't get asked. I was the one who waited for a seat at the table and stopped hoping one would appear, but I showed up anyway, with a letter in my pocket and a voice no one expected. The room stayed still. I didn't get closure. I got clarity. And I think maybe that's better. I ended the recording, saved it without editing, and closed the laptop. Outside, the leaves rattled on the sidewalk like paper. I stood at the window, watching the streetlights flicker, and I felt a sense of completion, not finality, but a kind of arrival. I hadn't come full circle. I'd stepped off the map and made a new one. A week later, Amanda invited me over for dinner. It wasn't a holiday. No one had died. There was no reason beyond "we want you here." Nathan came too. Grace wore a sweater she'd drawn on with marker stick figures of our family with captions that said things like, "Mom is the boss," "Uncle Caleb writes cool stuff," and "Grandpa is a cloud." After dinner, we sat on the floor playing a board game. At one point, Grace turned to me and said, "Did you miss Grandpa before he died?" I nodded. "Me too," she said, even though I didn't know him yet. And that hit harder than anything else had all year. She didn't know him, but she missed the idea of him. She missed what she sensed we had lost. Later, after she went to bed, Amanda and I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes. She asked if I was going to write about all this. "I already am," I said. She nodded. "Will you write about me?" "Only the good parts," I teased. She laughed. "Then it'll be a short book." But we both knew that wasn't true. When I left that night, she hugged me longer than usual. "I'm glad you read the letter," she said. "Me too." "I'm glad he wrote it." And I nodded. "Me too." There are still days when I feel the old ache rise up, usually on the quiet mornings when I open the studio, and the light hits the floor just like it did that first day. I think about all the people who never got a letter, never got the apology, never got the names spoken aloud in love. That's why I keep the wall. That's why I let strangers write their own pages, their own endings. Some things we can't rewrite, but we can add to them. We can build something next to the ruin. We can light a candle where the silence used to be. Sometimes, when the studio is empty, I sit by the window and open the original letter again. The paper is more fragile now, the ink fading, but the words hold. They always hold. I don't know where the story ends. I don't think I need to. What I know is this: I was the son who wasn't asked to speak. So I brought the letter, and in doing that, I found my voice. And now it won't stop speaking. Not because it needs to be heard, but because someone, somewhere, is still waiting for their letter too. And maybe it's my turn to write it.